everybody. I want to get started on time because we do have folks who are joining us online. And thank you all for being here so promptly. My name is Rebecca Dinwiddie. I am a co-director of the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics. And we are a nonpartisan, interdisciplinary center here at the University of Oregon. And we promote civic and civil dialogue on public affairs, and we foster education, research, and leadership to advance justice and inclusive democracy. And we carry forward the legacy of Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, who was also Dean and a constitutional law professor here at U of O. So I appreciate all of you taking the time to join us here and online. I want to thank our panelists who have prepared their thoughts for this evening. And I want to thank our many donors who I see in the audience who help support us and keep our public events free and open to the public. So when we conceived of this event 6 weeks ago, the title, Disruption versus Stability, Impacts on People and Policy Under a New Republican Majority, made sense. Americans were promised, and we expected, a flourish of disruptive and impactful executive orders, policy changes especially on particular issues, right? We knew that was coming. But I think few of us envisioned what is going on right now. And so I think a more apt title for this talk might simply be Disruption, or perhaps Constitutional Crisis. And I think you know I'm not being histrionic with that. So in that vein, given that there seems to be no room for the word stability anymore in the title, I think we are going to need to find that within ourselves and our communities. And so in that vein, and because I'm a little woo-woo, I just invite you all to kind of ground yourselves and take a deep breath, because we're going to be covering a lot of intense stuff. Here is the flow of today's events. We're going to start on your left of the panel, taking a look at what's going on in the executive branch and Congress. Then we'll move this way, and we'll have panelists address some specific key issues that people have a lot of questions about. We couldn't hit everything, so we're doing our best. And then we'll wrap up looking at some ways that people are pushing back and resisting. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And just so you know, you can text your questions to Abby Stilley, our Associate Director, and on the handout that was given out when you came in, the text number is at the top. It can also be found on the Wayne Morse Center's page for this event, for those of you who are joining online. And also on that page, I'll wrap up soon, by the way. There are short bios of our speakers. Let's see, we've given our speakers a very tall order. They each only have 6 minutes to cover very complex issues. So God love you, thank you. Today is just going to be a snapshot, and Dan Tichenor is going to things moving time-wise. So again, thank you for being here. I hope you give us some grace, knowing that we can't cover everything, we can't answer everything. Today is a snapshot, but we're going to do the best we can. My first question is for Assistant Professor of Political Science, Chandler James. My question is, what are the consequences, both political and institutional, of the President using unilateral action to bypass the traditional policymaking process?
So thank you for the question, and thank you for the audience for being here tonight and taking the opportunity to engage in our politics and our political discussion. I want to respond to this question by discussing at first the politics of unilateral action, which is quite distinct from the politics that normally accompany what we think of as the conventional policymaking process, in which laws are debated in Congress and then crafted, negotiated with the president, and then ultimately, if they are passed with a support of the majority of the Congress and the signature of the president. The politics of unilateral action is much different. And this is something that scholars have been thinking about for a while now, but using formal modeling and things of that nature to assess rigorously some of the dynamics of this process. And with respect to the politics of unilateral action, the first thing to consider is that the president acts first, and they have the initiative. And they, upon creating a policy through this kind of unilateral process, they actually change law until and unless Congress responds or they're overturned by the Supreme Court. And so that changes the entire political dynamic. Whereas the normal political process is filled with veto points and deliberation and negotiation, presidents who use executive orders and executive actions to make policy do so immediately, and that's what we're seeing with respect to the Trump administration. And now we're seeing that some of these actions are being assessed by the courts. The president has some discretion in the politics of unilateral action. We don't know, he doesn't or she doesn't know exactly which actions will be constitutional or not constitutional. And so you expect that you try some things, throw it at the wall and see what sticks. We saw this with respect to the Biden administration and his actions on student loans, which were eventually overturned at the Supreme Court level. Trump has taken the politics of unilateral action and pushed it to the extreme. There's less concern about whether or not it's unconstitutional. The entire logic, I believe, of his action is action, action, action. To move first and ask questions later. And this is similar to some of the activity we've seen with DOGE, which is get in there, break things, and see what happens. And it's totally distinct from the typical legislative process and the typical governmental process. So Trump is taking advantage of this politics by reducing the amount of discretion that he and his administration have with respect to what they think is constitutional or not. So presidents have been using unilateral action to shape policy increasingly over the last 60 years, but the Trump administration is pushing this to the extreme. And I want to tie this into the unitary executive theory, which is a constitutional theory supported by many conservatives who like the idea of a very strong president. And the idea of the unitary executive theory is that presidents are solely in control of the executive branch, and that they can dismiss members of the executive branch at their discretion. This flies in the face of typical practice and the role of Congress in overseeing the federal government and shaping the way that laws are executed. And the unitary theory, executive theory, in many respects, challenges the notion of independent agencies, which are agencies that are run by individuals who serve not at the pleasure of the president, but have independent power. And people, supporters of this idea, believe that these things are unconstitutional, that they encroach upon the president's authority. This is a major change in presidential bureaucratic relations and presidential congressional relations. similar to the politics of unilateral action. This reshapes the playing field in our politics and undermines the bureaucratic prerogative under the civil service protections and their ability to make policy and follow the guidelines of Congress. So I think that with respect to these actions that the Trump administration has taken through executive orders, it's fundamentally reshaped how policy is created and how the executive branch is run. And I think it's clear to me that this bodes for significant change with respect to how bureaucracies are shaped if they feel like they no longer have the protections that were afforded to them under the previous regime.
Thank you, Professor James. So next we have former Congressman Peter DeFazio, who served this district so ably for 36 years. He's also and of course, not just this district, but like Wayne Morse, really the whole country. He's also a senior fellow, senior fellow at the Wayne Morse Center, which we appreciate. So, Congressman, after the preamble to the Constitution, the very first sentence is, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States." That's Article 1, Section 1, first sentence of the Constitution, because their most recent, I assume, it's because the most recent executive was a king, and they wanted to be really clear. So will members of Congress, any of them, act as a check on executive power? And, seriously, because I know it's bleak, but are there any levers, any points in the congressional calendar that they can exert their legislative power?
Okay, thanks. Well, obviously these are incredibly unprecedented times. I served there 36 years, served through the first Trump presidency, a number of wars, and a whole number of other catastrophes, the 2008 collapse, 9/11. But this is beyond anything I could have ever conceived of. We are in a burgeoning constitutional crisis. Within a 90-minute time period today, 3 judges ruled against the administration. In particular, one judge ruled against the spending freeze, calling it rational, imprudent, and triggering a national crisis. The question is going to become when and if this goes to the Supreme Court, what's going to happen there? So at this point, we're in a real struggle here. Congress could do things. Remember, the president is impounding funds. We have an Anti-Impoundment Act. We have a Supreme Court ruling saying the president doesn't have authority. We have a long-standing DOJ memo saying the president doesn't have that authority. Only Congress has the power of the purse to designate spending, and then that spending is supposed to be carried out lawfully by the executive branch. So we're at a point now where, what could Congress do? Well, last time the president did this was when he withheld the funds from Ukraine and Congress impeached him. Unfortunately, given the spineless nature of a number of senators, despite Mitch McConnell giving great speeches about how horrible this all was, they exonerated him twice. So here we are. Is this Congress going to act to impeach President Trump? No. At this point, they are acting like a doormat. Elon Musk is wiping his feet on the United States Congress. I don't know what is going to happen, when they are going to have the guts to stand up. There was little resistance today, up until today, on their reconciliation bill, so-called reconciliation bill. This is a bill that will bankrupt the United States of America. If Trump gets everything he wants, and they do the mean-spirited but pretty insignificant cuts given the size of this bill, if Congress passes that, we will create about $10 trillion of new debt. And we're already at 36 trillion. We've never been over 100% of GDP except World War II. This is a pending economic crisis in addition to everything else. What will stop them? Well, their constituents are getting a little antsy about this, but not antsy enough. There's got to be a lot more people in the streets at town hall meetings, emailing, phone calling, joining groups that are taking action, doing everything we can do to let them know this is not an isolated segment of the United States of America that's upset about Elon Musk taking powers that even the president shouldn't have and doesn't have according to the Constitution of the United States of America. So that is, where we're at this point in time. There are other countries that have gone down this path. Turkey, Poland, and Hungary. And he talks about Orban all the time. He loves what Viktor Orban did there. Russell Bott says they're going to ignore the courts until it's finally litigated by the Supreme Court. And then even if the Supreme Court rules, how does a court enforce its orders with someone who doesn't want to follow the rule of law? Usually they use U.S. Marshals. The president appoints the head of the U.S. Marshals. Then there's the military who are sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States, not the President of the United States. And Hickseth is in the process of cleaning out. He took out all the judge advocates general so they can get people in there who will say, oh no, you posse comitatus, don't worry about that. You can use U.S. troops against U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. So we are really at an incredible crisis point here. And we can't get dispirited, stick our heads in the sand. We have to all take whatever action we have within our capability. There's an action on the 28th to withhold spending for a day. That could be a little start, but there's going to have to be a lot more than that. So with that, I'd be happy to pass on to the next one.
So just to follow up on that, we have Associate Professor of Law, Greg Dotson. And Greg, you were a senior staffer in both the House and the Senate, and you served as Democratic Chief Counsel to the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. And you know how the sausage is made. I'm just wondering if you have anything to add to the conversation about Congress.
Well, I may not have anything to add. I think you've heard a great summary so far, but I'll try to contribute my 2 points on this. And I think this is a more fundamental issue than how sausage is made. I think what we have is a president that is behaving in ways that no modern president has really acted in. And I would offer sort of 2 points that build on comments that have already been made. The first is that we see, as everyone learned in grade school, we have 3 branches of government. The Constitution allocates responsibilities and duties between those 3 branches. And what the president is doing is seeking to consolidate power, steal authorities from those other branches, from the legislative branch and from the judicial branch, and have them for the executive branch. And as was mentioned in the... okay, great. As was mentioned, the president is asserting that he has the authority to not spend money that Congress has provided for certain purposes. We know that is, in a word, unlawful. Congress passed a law 50 years ago prohibiting that. We have a Supreme Court decision, as the congressman said. And yet that's what's happening right now. We're playing this game of cat and mouse in the courts to see if what's going to happen there. Are they going to defy a court order on that issue? Recent executive orders have attempted to steal authority from the courts, from the judicial branch. They're doing that in ways of naming the president as someone who can provide authoritative interpretations of the law, and then saying that no one in the federal government can advance any position inconsistent with those. Also saying that they're not going to enforce regulations that they believe exceed sort of the scope of what is constitutionally permitted from Congress. So in many cases, you have regulations, they've been challenged in court, the judicial branch has upheld them, and now we have a new take on it where the president can simply decide, I think that is not consistent. That's not the best reading of the law. I'm interpreting it so that it is unconstitutional and then telling his agencies not to enforce those laws. So this is all very troubling. And then the second point I wanted to make, and obviously leads to a lot of destabilization in policies that we just form the social contract. The second point I wanted to make is that there is a real effort of eroding the mechanisms that provide sort of a neutral bureaucracy. So everyone is treated fairly under the law. We're seeing, and we should all want that. We should want that because it guarantees that federal employees can report wrongdoing and coercion or corruption. It means that when they implement the law, you're not getting a partisan version of the law, you're getting a neutral version of the law. Federal bureaucracy looks at a mission that looks beyond the horizon that the current president might look at. We're seeing lots of efforts to undo that, and they're focused on like a laser on that. Firing inspector generals who receive the complaints from federal employees that there could be violations of the law. And there's been examples of this, and I think we're even seeing perhaps currently the politicization of both the military and Federal Bureau of Investigations that are following current events.
Thank you. That was a really great summary and disturbing summary. I'm going to give you a little extra time because you are an expert on climate and energy, and I have a question related to that. On the first day of the new administration, very first day in office, President Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, which is a legally binding international treaty that brings all nations, almost, together to combat climate change and adapt to its effects. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on what is going on with climate issues or the environment right now and in the past month.
Be happy to take two seconds on that. So the Paris Climate Agreement, in some ways, is not that meaningful. It is essentially a voluntary agreement by all the nations of the world that climate change is really important. We're all going to do our part, and we're going to get together and talk about it. We're going to say what we did, and that's going to be a mechanism for increasing our ambition over time. On the other hand, it's extremely important because it is a statement that this is a crisis that we all face together, and we must do all we can. And so the reason I sort of say it that way is the president, in withdrawing us from the Paris Climate Agreement, didn't do it because there's some burdensome commitment that he doesn't want the country to be exposed to. It's about sending a message, and that message is climate change is unimportant, we're not going to worry about it, and you shouldn't either. And that's what we're already seeing in many executive actions. Firing of environmental and energy experts, Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, Department of Justice. There's a real excise here of that expertise. We're stripping every reference to climate change from the USDA website, looking to undermine NOAA. And so this is not some ancillary, tertiary goal of the administration. This is very much tied. This is a central proponent. They nominated oil company executives to the most senior cabinet level positions on day one. And the executive orders have focused on this. And just here in Oregon, every year we spend $8 billion to import and buy gasoline to power our cars and trucks. And the transition that is rapidly happening towards electric vehicles is going to erode that money. We are going to save money at the pump, And we're going to cut carbon pollution at the same time. And the oil companies would prefer if that doesn't happen. I mean, it would be that $8 billion is very nice. And so we're seeing a huge effort to rescind incentives that encourage wind, solar, electric vehicles. And that's all going to play out in the budget reconciliation bill that the Congressman referred to just a moment ago. So yes, it's very troubling. And it's a key function, it's a key part of the plan. I think we're seeing that goal.
Thank you. We're going to shift a bit. I want to welcome again Professor Melissa Buis from Willamette University. She is chair of the Politics, Policy, Law, and Ethics Department there. And Professor Buis, how much should we care about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. heading up the Department of Health and Human Services?
I have bigger issues, actually, than just RFK Jr., even though I will say he's largely wacky, wrong, and has many dangerous views. And just to provide a couple of highlights in case you haven't been following along, of course, he's an anti-vaxxer, believes that autism comes from vaccines. He's anti-fluoride, has said that fluoride was associated with arthritis, bone fractures, bone cancer, IQ loss, neurodevelopmental disorders, and thyroid disease. He's had a number of problematic things to say about COVID, but maybe I'll just limit it to how the pandemic was overstated and the US, quote, put hundreds of millions of dollars into ethnically targeted microbes. Every now and then he also throws out some things that maybe make sense about ultra-processed food. But I'm not as worried about him in particular, any one individual that Trump appoints. Really, since Ronald Reagan, Republicans have been appointing individuals as head of agencies whose political views are antithetical to the mission of those agencies. And while that matters, it does, political appointees have often been thwarted by civil servants, Congress, courts, and the law. So I worry a lot less about any one individual at the top as long as the protections are in place for the civil service. So it's really the combination of a RFK Jr. with the DOGE wild gutting of various agencies that is the problem. And HHS is a huge bureaucracy. We're talking about 80,000 employees across 13 different agencies. And they're dealing with things like drug approvals, food safety, disease surveillance, Medicaid and Medicare, things we really care about, vaccines, CDC, funding programs to address the opioid crisis. So this work matters in direct ways that affect our lives and our well-being. And these are tasks that are very complicated and difficult to resolve under the best circumstances of having competent people and a reasonable budget. And the US already has some very concerning problems with its healthcare system. So in the recent report by the Commonwealth Fund by David Blumenthal, just this past fall, he looked at 10 countries, OECD countries, and found that the US ranks last on 4 of 5 health outcome measures. Life expectancy is more than 4 years below the 10-country average. And the US has the highest rates of preventable and treatable deaths for all ages, as well as excess deaths related to the pandemic for people under 75. We also have the ongoing substance abuse issue and gun violence, which really puts us in a precarious health position. The United States continues to have the highest rate of maternal deaths of any high-income nation, even despite a recent decline since COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, within the US, that rate is by far the highest for Black women. And most of these deaths, we think like 80% of them are preventable. So it really matters who we have in charge and what we're doing with those agencies. But we also have the combination of Republican control of Congress that's already been discussed, and a desire on the part of the administration and congressional leaders to pay for a $4 trillion tax cut. It's pretty much impossible to get there without cutting Medicaid, especially with promises to seniors not to touch Social Security. So the latest number that I saw out of the House was $880 billion. And that is serious money. There's some pushback I saw today from some Republican congresspersons from states that have expanded Medicaid. And we're now up to 40 states plus the District of Columbia that have expanded Medicaid. And that's like 83 million people who rely on Medicaid for their health care. About 25% of the population, and nearly half of all births in this country are paid for by Medicaid. So I see the beginnings of constituents getting upset and concerned about what this is going to mean, but we also have to realize that we have possibilities for global pandemic now, and having lived through this once, again, a global pandemic is difficult with competent people, with a healthcare system that distributes care based on need instead of ability to pay, and with careful planning and tracking. But we now are entering a time where science is just really disregarded, misinformation flourishes and is encouraged, and Trump's own handling of the last pandemic should cause us all to be quite concerned.
Thank you. Next up, we have Dean of the Lundquist College of Business and a Knight Professor of Social Science, Bruce Blonigen. And I have a two-part question. What are the economic consequences of the tariffs that President Trump is pursuing and threatening to implement? And could any of the administration's economic policies be beneficial? And I'm going to give you an example because I've been searching for a silver lining. It takes a lot of carbon to ship things overseas. And perhaps if we are making more things in the United States, we're contributing less to climate change. So are there any benefits, and is there anything that you're particularly concerned about?
Okay, thank you very much. So I come from the dismal science, economics, but I will start with a little bit of a positive, at least for me, is that I think we're at the highest level ever of American public awareness that import tariffs are actually taxes we pay, and that it actually raises prices, which has not been something that people, I think, even realize. But it's up to like 70%, understand that in a public poll. That's incredible. But let's move on. I will say with tariffs, both parties have been sort of enamored with tariffs. There are some different reasons. So Biden kept the Trump tariffs on, right, for instance. There are some reasons why you'd want to use tariffs. One is unfair trade practices. So if a country is dumping goods into your country that are just very low priced and are going to just drive out your firms, and it's not based on competitive advantage, you don't want that, and you want to mitigate that. National defense purposes. So you also want to make sure that you continue to have the ability to produce things that are important for national defense and food security. That doesn't hit as many sectors oftentimes as many people think, but it is definitely something that we want to think about. A third reason is job protection, and I think that's the one that comes up in a lot of folks' minds, and what a lot of parties would say is what we should, why we should be imposing import tariffs. And it does. It protects that domestic industry that's producing that good. Unfortunately, again, it comes with those higher prices. And when you start to look at, higher prices versus saving jobs, it's usually a very, very costly job protection program. One example was washing machines. Went up about, we put tariffs on that, 10, 20%. It turns out we gained 1,800 jobs across 3 plants here in the United States. But then all of us ended up paying about $1.5 billion annually more for our washing machines. And that comes out to about $815,000 per job saved. And this is not a unique example. I've been doing this for 30 years. This is how this comes out. This is also before you start thinking about retaliation and them putting tariffs on our goods and us losing jobs in our export sectors. And I oftentimes say, so $800,000 to save a $100,000 job, we could pension off that person for the rest of their life and one of their descendants forever. In fact, we could do 2 of them and we'd still be better. Now again, public policy around how you do that, I get it, but it's a very expensive job protection program. And again, that's even before possibilities of retaliation. And so this is where it's been different with Trump, because what he has proposed, I mean, day one, he came out, and I think he's all excited because he's found this weapon that you can use against other countries in negotiations. And that's what we've done. We also use that politically for economic sanctions, oftentimes are around trade. This is the main way in which countries actually interact with each other economically. So now he's got this weapon. And so he is spouting out some very high tariff numbers. So if we do 10% on China and 25% on Mexico and Canada, we will lose about 0.8 percentage points on GDP growth. So that means instead of 3% annually, for instance, you'd have 2.2. That's huge. So now, I think a lot of folks are like, he's just being crazy like a fox. It's not gonna happen. He's using it as a negotiation tool. This is what he does. And there could be something to that, right? I mean, we're seeing this with the Ukraine war today. There's some negotiations where, okay, you can say he's gotten some concessions. So is that what's going on? Well, possible. But I would say you also have to be very careful that you don't want to start a trade war. And are people going to trust you? And that's, the trade war is what deepened the Great Depression. And it was so top of mind that when we concluded World War II, one of the first things that the Allied powers did is sit down and create the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade so that we could spend time reducing our tariffs together. And we're, right now, if he goes through with these types of tariffs and there's the kind of retaliation we would expect, we've just unwound about 3 decades of negotiations. So, now you want me to talk about, let me just say real quick about big picture actions with economic consequences, some possibilities for further conversation, Q&A if you want. Benefits. Well, so Trump's team would say, first of all, government waste. And I will say there is government waste. And so there is room to attack government waste. I'm not sure the way they're doing it with Doge is the way that one would want to go about it. Deregulation. Certainly there is a lot of regulation. If you read about Germany, that has become a real issue for them and had a big impact on their elections. And I think we have room to be thinking about all the layers of regulations that we have. But again, it's like, where do you put that regulation or deregulation? Again, we can talk about it some more. Lower taxes. Lower taxes is great. It spurs economic growth. However, if you don't lower spending and you start racking up debt, we have some real issues. We're getting the 1-minute warning. Good. I think I'm almost there. Major concerns. Okay, certainly cuts to federal spending. We heard what could happen to Medicaid. Some very large cuts in spending. So again, maybe you are trying to balance out those tax cuts, but those tax cuts are really, really large. And again, just working on the federal employees is not going to do it. You're going to have to get into these entitlement programs. Mass deportation. I'm queuing up Dan, but there's lots of economic consequences to that, including tighter labor supply, which would increase inflation. But the biggest one I'm going to talk about is economic uncertainty. No one likes economic uncertainty. And we're reading already that businesses are sitting there going, I don't know where to invest. Do I keep relying on Canadian suppliers and Mexican suppliers, my 2 largest trade partners? People don't know if they're going to lose their job, they're not going to do purchases. So you start to not have business investment and not have consumer purchases, you will very quickly go into recession. You put on tariffs, you're going to quickly have inflation. You put the two together, and you have stagflation. So those are real concerns, and you can't just flip the switch and say, just kidding, it's all done. I mean, I suppose if you did it tomorrow, okay, maybe. But as you go further and further, people don't know what kind of information to trust, and it's really easy to lose trust and really hard to regain.
I feel like this is the live human version of doom scrolling on Facebook. So next we have our time limit enforcer extraordinaire.
Not gonna be Alison.
Huh?
She's been deputized.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, you got to keep him in line. So, Ninth Chair of Social Science and my co-director at the Wayne Morse Center, Dan Tichenor. Here's my question for you. So, immigration was obviously one of the key issues in the 2024 election. And predictably, the Trump administration is pursuing an aggressive agenda on immigration. Will they be able to do what they want and are aiming for? Or are there any checks or guardrails or pushback perhaps from certain sectors of the economy?
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. So this is, you can hear me okay, buddy?
And I just want to add, this is a really important human issue. So when I talk about the economy, I also understand that this is people living in terror.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about doom scrolling, you might think this is the most, you can't hear me okay? The most, grave of our issues. I think the answer, though, which I don't think uplifting, but it's more mixed than we might assume. We've never had a modern president who has marketed oneself as a xenophobe more effectively and more regularly. And if any of you were watching on Valentine's Day, you saw kind of the meme that went out. So there's a cult of cruelty and so forth. I think in terms of rhetoric, in terms of messaging and so forth, I don't think we have good checks and told Democrats or others on the other side to come good at 30-second spots to respond to it. But when it comes to executive actions, I think the record is actually a bit more mixed on this. That's why I think the answer hinges upon exactly what kind of immigration action we're talking about. And I think we can evaluate these immigration actions in probably three rough categories: things that are long shots, things that can be described as contenders, and actions that are sure things, where his power is at the zenith. In the first category, you might think of things where the Trump administration is challenging standing law or the Constitution. And an obvious example of this would be, for instance, his proposal on, I believe it was January 21st, to rescind birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants. Last time I checked, a president can't amend the Constitution by herself or himself, and so that's going to face enormous political headwinds and judicial headwinds. I'll give an example of something that's kind of in the middle category, and that would be something so if you followed all the headlines with this flurry of activities, one of them is he twice has promised to rescind temporary protected status. First for, I remember during the campaign, when he talked about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, eating our cats and dogs. He promised that he would, in fact, revoke temporary protected status for Haitians, about 500,000 of them. And he has done that by executive order. He also, prior to that, did it for 600,000 Venezuelans. And what I would note, again, the courts here, I think, potentially stand out as an important check. In his first term, he did this, and it was stopped by the court. This is a violation of the the Administrative Protective Act. And moreover, there has to be certain conditions that whoever revokes it, in this case it would be the DHS secretary, has to show that conditions in the country have changed. You can't just do it willy-nilly. So that would be an example of things that just by a stroke of a pen, you're not necessarily going to succeed. The third category is, of course, what Bruce is talking about, which is there are these areas in which our chief executive has enormous discretion, where their power is at its zenith. And the obvious example of this is, in fact, about, has to do with the arrest, detention, and deportation of undocumented immigrants, actually any immigrants. Presidents have enormous power in this regard. And in this way, also, we can perceive a long-term historical trajectory of building up the country's detention and deportation state. We have an enormous set of private detention facilities who contribute both to Democrats and Republicans, which is very powerful. We have a certain set of number of beds that are set aside in federal facilities. And so when Trump talks about using military facilities, if you listen about what's happening in Guantanamo Bay, enormous amount of power the president has to enforce these laws. Border security is another example of this. But I would say, even here, the president does not have unchecked power. So if any of you are real nerds on this issue, you might note that Trump has proposed using the Enemy Aliens Act of 1798, yes, we're going to the 18th century, which provided presidents with sweeping powers to deport en masse immigrants of certain countries. But it requires there to be a wartime crisis. And so that, again, is an example where one would expect to be lots of steady judicial headwinds. So I mentioned the courts a lot in response to your question about potential checks and guardrails. What about other restraints? Congress, I don't know, Peter, if this is good news or bad news, it's not totally a doormat. I think it would play a mixed role. I would say that the biggest source of our discontent surrounding immigration and refugee policy is the fact that for at least 30 years, Congress has been deadlocked on comprehensive immigration reform. So the biggest failing from my perspective is the inability to reach a compromise that combines border security and pathways to citizenship. That said, in its first term, the Trump administration hoped to pass sweeping legal immigration reform to constrain those opportunities and failed and faced significant resistance from both Republicans and Democrats. Federalism is a really interesting flashpoint on this. I've been given the 1 minute thing, so I'm going to dash by it, but I'll simply say there's going to be a fundamental clash between sanctuary cities and states. You already saw it in the first term, it's happening now, and the Trump administration, Trump has sued New York and Chicago and so forth. What's fascinating about this, if you look at public opinion polling, 54% of Americans oppose the Trump administration imposing any kind of penalties on sanctuary places, so that's interesting. So speaking of public opinion, could that be a source of restraint? You look after the 24 election and say, how could that be? At the moment, a majority of Americans support mass deportation plans and other restrictive policies, and this fits a global trend. How many of you followed the German election over the weekend? The latest country where voters rejected a left-leaning government, largely because of their unhappiness over immigration and the economy. Same thing in Austria, Britain, France, Italy, and the Netherlands, Sweden, and elsewhere. The anti-immigrant right has really become strong. Yet at the same time, what's interesting is that 58% of Americans in a number of recent polls say they favor enhanced deportation efforts, but 64% in the very same polls say that undocumented people should have the ability to stay if they pass security checks. US public opinion, a lot of political scientists would say, can be quite thermostatic. And what they mean by that, jargon inflation, is that it often moves in the opposite direction of whoever's in government. That is, especially when the public thinks that policies are moving too far in one direction. Trump and family separation policy in the first term is a great example of this. So my final point is, as a student of social movements, I also would note that grassroots activism, protest, and resistance have made significant difference in terms of immigration policies and governments in the past, and I think they very well can in this administration. And I'll say one last quick thing to sneak in.
You are ridiculous.
I know, and that is just picking on something that Bruce had mentioned, which is that an unexpected source of resistance also can come from within the right, from businesses and employers, who may resist key aspects of immigration restriction agenda that Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller has in mind. So think about, if you watched early, even before the transition period, one of the critical debates on the right was between MAGA diehards who were kind of xenophobic and tech bros who wanted to make sure that H-1B skilled workers would be protected. guess what? That's exactly where agribusiness comes in terms of farm workers and so forth. And I'll just try to make one quick story now. What year does the 2020s remind me of? A lot of the 1920s in terms of our xenophobia, restrictions, and so forth. But there was an important unsavory bargain that was cut in the 1920s between nativists and a number of ranchers and growers and so forth, where they said, we'll stop Asian immigration, we'll stop Jewish immigration, we'll stop European overseas immigration, but only if you leave the southern border porous so we can have absolute access to Mexican labor. And I think that's what we're likely to see, is that kind of bargain cut during this next 3 years. So thank you for letting me go way over my time.
Thank you. You made important points. So speaking of another group that is being targeted and is very vulnerable in terms of their safety, would be LGBTQ folks. And we are lucky to have Professor of Political Science and Department Head of Political Science, Alison Gash, to talk a bit about that. She's going to do double duty because after she talks about that, she is going to share with us some of the things that people are doing to push back, resist, because a lot of people are very fired up and not just despairing. So, Alison, my question for you is, it's been 10 years since the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell v. Hodges, in which it found that there is a fundamental right to same-sex marriage in the U.S. Constitution. So 10 years, and it felt like we had accomplished so much. I worked on that for a while, that issue for a while. So what are the most pressing attacks on LGBTQ folks right now? And why are they happening, especially given the progress that we made previously?
Yeah, so again, thank you everyone for being here tonight. So I'm gonna try to scale down my comments and just sort of go through the laundry list of the things that are happening around LGBTQ, and then I'm also gonna add in DEI so that I can get to some of the resistance stories, because I think we all need a little bit of inspiration, right? I think we've been loaded with some heavy stuff, and I think we need a way forward. So, you know, I want to split this out between things that the federal government has significant authority to do, and sort of some of the stuff they have done, and some of the stuff we're sort of waiting to see what they'll do, and then stuff that the federal government claims they have the right to do, but maybe doesn't, right? And that's where I'm going to spend a little bit of time as well. So obviously the federal government, in particular, the president, has the right and has exercised his right to fire members of the bureaucracy. They've done this through anti-DEI initiatives. A great deal of these anti-DEI firings have been leveled against employees of color and against queer and trans employees as well. And so, you know, does the president have the right to do this? He largely does, because he is also, you know, the head of the federal bureaucracy, the head of his federal staff. And so he has the right to do this and continues to do this. There are some issues around whether he can actually fire people without cause. And so there are going to be some actions that are waged by these fired employees for those dismissals around DEI issues. But this was something that he anticipated doing rather quickly. It was something that was spelled out in Project 2025. In much of the intro, this was all about firing of so-called DEI workers, and he did just that. The second deals with this question of documentation, right? A lot of us don't really worry about our documents, right? Or things like birth certificates or things like passports. But for a lot of groups, LGBTQ individuals in particular, documentation matters, right? So back in the day, when gay couples were not able to get married, right, prior to the last decade,
Folks who were co-parents in same-sex relationships needed documentation that demonstrated that they were in fact legally connected to their children. They needed that documentation to pick their children up from school. They needed that documentation to take their children to the hospital or to a physician. And we see that same sort of question around documentation with transgender individuals, especially with the differences between the gender listed on their birth certificate and the gender that may be listed on a driver's license or a passport, and with very little room to correct those discrepancies, or sometimes without any possibility of documenting their gender identity. And so this is leaving transgender individuals in a state of document ambiguity, where they really don't have actual documentation that demonstrates and reflects who they are, which has obvious implications for their capacity to even just travel, right, from one place to the next, from one state to the next, from the United States to international spaces. It really puts their identity in flux in really deeply problematic ways. And then the third thing that the federal government has some control over, and not necessarily Trump himself, but certainly the court that he created, is of course marriage, right? The question on a lot of people's minds is a Burger Bell gonna fall? We do have the Respect for Marriage Act that sort of protects the rights that were encoded in Obergefell versus Hodges, in the sense that all states have to respect, right, marriages that have been formed in other states. So if you have a state that allows for same-sex marriages to be performed, then every state has to recognize that marriage as being legal and legitimate. However, right, there are efforts underway in Idaho, in Michigan, and a couple of other places, and certainly by a group called Mass Resistance and a group called the Alliance Defending Freedom, to knock down Hodges, right? In fact, Matt Staver, who is one of the biggest opponents of same-sex marriage, has said explicitly it's not a matter of if, but when, right? And we know that there are at least a couple of justices on the Supreme Court that are sort of itching for a moment to revisit that case. So I think it's just a matter of which state is going to ultimately bring suit against that particular holding. So we're in a bit of a holding pattern on that particular issue. Now, the area where we are in dicier footing, and where there is, I think, a lot of room for pushback, is on this federal funding issue. So here we have federal funding that has been removed or has been threatened to be removed if you mention gender ideology, right? If you mention gender identity, if you mention sexuality, if you mention LGBTQ people, if you mention race. We've got federal funding that has been threatened to be removed, right? Current grants being removed, and then future grant opportunities being removed. In particular, I'm thinking of NIH grants, and then of course NSF grants. And so this really affects, people scrubbing, right? This term that's being used now is scrubbing the identities, scrubbing questions around LGBTQ or racial status from grants, from positions, from questions that we ask about the populations we serve, from communities or issues that we study, from the groups that we host. Conferences have been canceled, speakers have been canceled from universities all across the country because of this threat that federal funding is going to be withdrawn. We also have some questions around whether institutional priorities will change, in particular from the Department of Education. Assuming that continues to exist, there's been threats that the things that we talk about in class, the curriculum we use, as well as the affinity groups and the programming that we allow on campus, will those be able to continue to apply, right, to LGBTQ people and to questions of race and racial justice. And then we also shift, right, this question of federal funding also exists around healthcare, right? And this is where, in particular, we're dealing with gender-affirming care and federal withdrawal of funds to hospitals that offer gender-affirming services. And so we've had a number of hospitals close down and cancel surgeries, close down and cancel treatment options for individuals, in particular transgender youth, who are in the middle of seeking gender-affirming care of all sorts of varieties. And so the question is, again, can the federal government do this? Can they tie questions and issues of gender, of sexuality, of race
to federal funding, right? And this is something that the Trump administration wants us to believe it can do, but there's a lot to suggest that they can't do it. And so one of the things that we're seeing happening is voluntary capitulation, right? Preemptive compliance, right? We're seeing hospitals just decide, right, to fold. We're seeing universities decide to remove their DEI programming. We're seeing professors decide to scrub any reference to race or sexuality or gender. Incidentally, one of the words that is banned from the federal grants is woman, right, but not man, right, or female but not male, right? So there's all sorts of ways in which it's getting ridiculous what needs to be scrubbed and what can stay. But the reality is, right, and this is sort of where I want to get into the fighting, right, the fight back that we can engage in. And the reality is there's lots of opportunities for us to fight back, right? A lot of the stuff that's already been mentioned, of course, federal courts. We know there's 80 plus court cases already afoot, battling a bunch of these executive orders, right? So, and we know 3 just in the last hour, right, or the last, I guess, 2 hours at this point, were not wins for the Trump administration. We also, right, Congress isn't doing much now, right? We don't want to sort of applaud what Congress is doing now, but the reality is there is the structure for especially the House to be really effective. And how can the House be effective? The House can be effective if we amp up all of those community meetings that are taking place, right? The public meetings that are taking place, the harassing and the haranguing of our federally elected officials, in particular our House members, right, who really are vulnerable to constituency demands in ways that the Senate and certainly the President are not. And so the more that we continue to state our disappointment, right, the more that we continue to unite, right, as a populace around our disappointment in what is happening at the federal government, the more that our House members will be required to listen, because of course our disappointment, right, is reflected in their capacity to keep their job, and they know that, right? They know that, and so the more that we continue to hold them accountable to constituency demands, the more likely it is that Congress will actually do something. The more likely it is that House members will actually stand up, and we're seeing that happen. The other thing that we forget about in this whole, right, in this sort of weaponizing of federal government, right, especially around LGBTQ and racial justice, is the fact of state law, right? And here we sit in Oregon, which is, for LGBTQ folks, the safest state in the nation, right? The safest state in the nation for queer people and for trans people, and I'm proud to be here. And we have state law to buffer a lot of what is happening. In fact, the state of Oregon is actively fighting back because what the federal government is asking it to do is to actually defy its own state mandates. It's asking it to defy its own interpretation of its own constitutional obligations to all of its citizens. And so there's a lot of room for the federal courts to agree with Oregon, to agree with states that have healthy protections in exactly the arena of DEI and exactly the arena of LGBTQ rights, and they're doing exactly that, right? And we don't hear about that a lot. We hear a lot about states that are folding. We hear a lot about states that are capitulating. We hear a lot about universities that are scrubbing and doing all that stuff. Oregon is not, right? Oregon is scaffolded, right, by strong state law, all right? And we need to remember that because we live, thank you, right? Right, we forget, right, especially, right, I know we're not supposed to be partisan, but especially Democrats forget that there are these things called states, right, that we've leaned heavily into the federal government, but states are available, right, and they're muscular, right, in their capacity to fight back, and we need to do some encouraging on that end. Same with local law, right, local law, local mandates can really, really? I'm going to take 50 more seconds, exactly. Right, but local law, right? Our local governments can do a lot, but so can private actors, right? And this is where things like our boycotts really help. This is where things like where we choose to spend our money really helps. Target lost something like $15 million in the week after it decided to cancel its DEI initiatives. Costco has suddenly become a fan favorite, right? Because it didn't cave. Where we spend our dollars matters, right? Where we do our business matters. Who we support matters. And we don't need to rely on executive orders about where we spend our money. We can spend our money wherever we want, right? We have massive choice in that. We have massive choice in the values that we uphold in the kinds of money that we spend. And then finally, social norms, right? Executive orders can't stamp out social norms, right? They cannot stamp out communities and individuals, right? Queer people, trans people, BIPOC people, immigrants, we will not be stamped out. You can't scrub us from society. You might try to scrub us from grants. You might try to scrub us from the stuff that we learn in classes. But we're here. We're part of your community. We are your daughters. We are your sons. We are your wives. We are your best friends. We are here and part of your community, and people aren't going anywhere, and the allies aren't going anywhere. And as much as these executive orders are attempting to end, right, the incredible progress that we've made, they can't, not if we don't let them. And that's where I'm gonna end.
All right. I'm going to add to that mutual aid.
Yes.
A lot of folks are vulnerable now. More people will be increasingly vulnerable. If you know someone who's undocumented, ask them what they need to get and go get it for them, because they might not be safe. Well, they're not driving out to the grocery store or driving elsewhere.
Can I add one more thing to that? Because I just want to say, like, one of the things that I've heard in a lot of community meetings that I've been a part of is I feel like I need to stop doing the mutual aid that we have people who are working at the food pantry, and people will say, I feel like I need to do something more than work at the food pantry. No, work at the food pantry, because the people that needed you to work at the food pantry before are even more vulnerable now, right? They need you to do exactly what you were doing. The giving that you're doing is a form of resistance, right? We don't need to wait for a big flashpoint and a big flashy way to resist, right? Mutual aid, giving, right? Support, mutual support is resistance. It is resistance.
Yeah, engage in the way that works best for you, but do engage. And as a former organizer, I will also say there is the organizing tool of simply disrupting the normal functioning of society. And I don't mean rioting, though I'm sure some people will, but I mean not showing up for work. Economic strikes. The Flight Attendants Association of America has a lot of power when they say, we are not going to show up, so the planes won't fly, members of Congress can't get back and forth to their jobs. So, people are thinking creatively of how we can kind of put a stick in the wheel or in the spokes to put people pressure on. Now, I want to respect all of you and your desire probably to get some questions in. I also know some of you will leave. So I just want to say, go find joy, do things that spark joy, pet your cat, look up at the sky. We're in this for the long haul. It's going to be a marathon, and we can't stop living our colorful, vivid lives. Grab your friends, go out and get some coffee, and please hydrate. All right. So I want to first of all thank our panelists. And I also want to thank our Wayne Morse scholars who helped out with this event, and Ian Anderson and Abby Stilley, who wear many hats, but they are also helping to facilitate the question and answer period. So we have.
And also our moderator, Rebecca Dinwiddie.
Oh. So we have two ways of asking questions. One that I alluded to earlier, for those of you who text, and for those of you online, is to text your question to 632-4435, and Ian will read your question aloud. The other is to do kind of old school, like City Club of Eugene does, and come sit in some of these seats if you feel like you need to sit, if that works better for you, or line up here at the microphone. We're going to switch between text question and live question. And if coming up here is an accessibility issue for you, please wave, and Ian will bring a microphone over to you. So let's begin with a texted question. Oh, sorry. One question. Pick one question. And for those of you on the panel, not everyone has to answer every question.
What are you saying, Rebecca?
Okay, first question. What, if anything, can people in blue states do to influence vulnerable Republican legislators in other districts?
Well, if you got relatives in other states, get in touch with them. Friends in other states, get in touch with them. Support groups in those states that are pushing them. I tell you, Bernie has been going around targeting these people and holding town halls, and other elected officials could do things like that.
Ian, he was sitting there first, I think.
What? Special elections. At this point, the two special elections are hopeless. The third one that might have a possibility would be Elise Stefanik, but she hasn't resigned yet because she hasn't been named, and that's a 6-point R district, which would be tough. The others are much worse. Matt Gaetz's district is like 28 points R, and Walt's is, I think, 12 R, so they're impossible.
I guess this goes to Congressman DeFazio more than anyone. I've looked at this pretty carefully, and it seems like that we haven't just discussed the Democrats' nuclear bomb, which is simply vote no to all new spending. If Trump insists on ignoring the courts and Congress is a doormat, then the only way to get attention is to cut all spending to get change. And I realize that could threaten a lot of Democrats at the midterms, but if Trump's effectively a dictator, what's the point? So I just want to throw that out there.
No, you hit on a point. We have March 14th, all funding for the government runs out. We had a very long government shutdown in the first Trump term. It ended when the air traffic controllers at the TRACON that controlled the eastern United States did come to work one day. They were sick. And suddenly the next day, it ended. And you mentioned like the flight attendants, the pilots, anybody can bring part of this economy down. And then secondly is the debt limit, which is a real nuclear bomb. And there are a bunch of Republicans who have never, ever voted for and never, ever will vote to extend the debt limit, who are part of the Freedom Caucus. So they're going to have Democratic votes in the House to do the debt limit, but that's a very, very, Trump has already said, well, we can default and then we'll just bargain. He said that once, so that's a place that I wouldn't want to go. Chandler?
So members of Congress play a vital role in the politics of unilateral action. There's been some research done about what shapes public attitudes toward unilateral action, and what has been found is that when members of Congress speak out about a particular issue, members of the public are much more likely to change their position than if someone else said it. So members of Congress have a tremendous platform to shape the discourse around these unilateral actions. If they choose not to react, then that would suggest to the public quiescence and that maybe these aren't such a big deal. But if members of Congress choose to publicize these particular issues in a way that frames them negatively, that could have a tremendous effect on the way that the public understands these unilateral actions.
I know you couldn't hit every issue, but what about the immoral and dangerous betrayal of Ukraine and embrace of Putin? Doesn't this betrayal increase the incentive for nuclear proliferation both in Europe and Asia?
And Congressman DeFazio might be the best person to answer that, but I'm curious if any of our other panelists have.
Someone else take a turn.
Yeah, any of our poli-sci folks.
Okay, I couldn't hear the whole thing, I'm sorry.
Basically, what about the betrayal of Ukraine and embrace of Putin? Doesn't this increase the incentive for nuclear proliferation?
Yeah, I mean, the United States voting with Russia in the Security Council, and Belarus, and I can't remember who else. North Korea. It's extraordinary what Vance did when he went over there, meeting with the AFD, and and the things he said. We're breaking up NATO, and the new German chancellor says we are going to have to be able to defend ourselves. So yes, it could very likely lead. And besides that, the lesson for Ukraine is if Ukraine hadn't given up its nuclear weapons, they wouldn't be in the pickle they're in now.
Thank you. Okay, well, from what I've heard, to me, it seems that presidents before were more restricted by norms than by actual rules, right? Because it seems like Trump can just do all these things. So why were there no rules in place, particularly because we had a democratic president, and everybody was already talking about how bad the situation would be if Trump would come in power. Why were no rules put in place?
So there's a variety of reasons why norms structure politics rather than rules. Number one, if you have a rule for everything, then it makes it really difficult to operate in uncertain environments. And so norms often emerge in response to the kind of cracks and openings in the formal rules to make sure that governance is able to unfold. Norms often exist if the rules are bad and they don't really work for governance. Another reason why a norm might emerge and the presidency is replete with norms. In fact, so much of its structure is normative, not legal, and this is the reason why we have the situation that we're in, because Trump cares less about norms than your typical president. But one of the main reasons why norms are involved rather than, say, formal rules is because you can't get a working majority to create formal rules. And so in many respects, that's what we could see the culmination that we have now as a consequence of, is the fact that even though many norms were violated during the Trump administration, Republican support for Trump before his impeachments, after his impeachment and post-presidency, and now mean that the norms have less weight and the Democrats couldn't pass the 60-vote threshold to change what rules they believe they needed to change in order to secure the presidency. They made some strides in this respect, but not completely, and we can see now that the discretion that norms provide can be used to trample upon expectation and even the Constitution.
I'm going to amplify a little bit. So for most of the 19th century, executive power was viewed as being antithetical to democracy. And fast forward to Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and so forth, and it was reinterpreted that no, the way that we can get decisive action on behalf of the popular will is through creating lots of unilateral executive power. So, the imperial presidency takes off in the 20th century. And so I don't run afoul, again, of talking too long. I will say really quickly, fast forward to today, you said, why don't we have rules? Who makes the rules? Congress. In our current, past
at least quarter century, Congress is incapable of making profound rules on much of anything because of how polarized it is. So therefore, who fills the void? The presidency and executive orders.
Can I just chime in on that too? There are rules. They are breaking the rules. And there are lots of examples of that. Post-Watergate, Congress did a lot of reforms to ensure, President Nixon famously said, I'm going to have the FCC take away your license if you report news that we don't like. The FBI director was made a 10-year position, so there wouldn't be a partisan position. Well, they've just gone in and said, you're fired. And they can take it to court, and we'll wait a couple years and see how that comes out. And we've seen it with the, you can't fire federal employees unless you go through the Merit Review Board. They've just fired them. They locked them out of their offices. Okay, so go to court. And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of, sure, there are norms, that's very important, but there's also a lot of rules. Can't fire an inspector general without giving a period of notice and having it be for a specific reason. He just fired them all one night. So I think that's important too.
And let me just add one really quick thing, which is that the courts have completely monkeyed with the rules. So the courts are a big part of this problem. There were rules, and then, Supreme Court precedent altered, misinterpreted, expanded, disregarded the contours of those rules.
It seems there's a tendency for public voices, like legislators, to treat this administration's actions as part of a policy disagreement. How can we convince them to shift their response to address this situation as a massive threat to our republic?
You have the answers?
You have the answers, go.
Yeah. It seems there is a tendency for public voices, like legislators, to treat this administration's actions as part of a policy disagreement. How can we convince them to shift their response to address this situation as a massive threat to our republic?
So I kind of challenge the premise of the question in the sense that policy is fundamental to our republic. Policies can end the republic. You can create a policy that sends us on a path to war, that kills millions of people. You can create policies that kill millions of people. But I think the main thing that I want to suggest here is that bad policy is what got us into this situation in the first place. When you have an ineffective government, when you have a Congress that is gridlocked and doesn't make substantial policies to address the problems of the day, then people get frustrated. They throw their hands up. They say, Congress doesn't work. Congress is broken. The government's broken. We need to turn to someone who can fix it. And so I think that we should be thinking about these basic questions of policies as fundamental to the protection and preservation of our constitutional order.
Can you repeat the question one more time? Because I just want to make sure I have it right.
Yeah. Let me get it back up, sorry. Oh no, I may have deleted it.
Oh.
The question was, it seems like public voices are treating these disagreements with Trump as policy disagreements. How can we shift it so that they are viewing it as a threat to our republic?
My really quick and plausibly snarky response to that is that we did. We did. There was a lot. A lot of people were saying, this is a threat to our constitutional order, this is a threat to democracy. They even threw around the fascism word, pretty liberally, understandably. The answer is we did. The answer is people did. And the answer is people are, but people are not, but it's not resonating, right? It's not resonating. And part of politics is trying to figure out how to find the narrative that resonates. And that's not resonating in the way that maybe we would want it to.
And I'm just gonna check, is there anyone, again, who has an accessibility issue that prevents them from coming over here? Okay, great, so go ahead and then we'll.
Oh, sure.
Hi, my two favorite professors in the world here. I have had the privilege of taking these two professors' classes. They are dynamite, so please, if you can take them, take them. I actually had something to offer to piggyback what Professor Gash said in her presentation. There is a lot of ways that we can rebel. I actually represent a demographic that may or may not be represented here. I am a disabled woman with a queer trans partner who's Indigenous and a queer 12-year-old daughter. I'm also on Social Security and Medicaid, and there are a lot of things that our communities don't recognize as essential help, like helping pay rent, helping pay electric bills, helping pay phone bills, things that are standardly seen as things that people should take care of on their own. But unfortunately, our communities are falling apart, and the demographic that I see represented here is incredible people and very educated people, but there are so many people that we are trained to think of as not important or maybe not as educated, who are just barely trying to make their rent. And if it weren't for some incredible people that I have in my emotional life, I would be one of those people that would be this close to homelessness. So I encourage you all to maybe break with our historical social norms and start rebelling against the establishments that force high rents, that force high electric bills, high phone bills, and helping people with doing more than just going to coffee, but also with just basic needs. That is such an important thing that our disabled and homeless populations don't have enough help with. So I highly recommend that, and I thank you so much, all of you, for being here and for taking the time to talk to us all, because it's incredible.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
While you're getting the next question, can I just say, I didn't talk much about resilience and resistance, but of course that is at all of our fingertips. It can feel overwhelming. I get no proceeds from this, but beautifultrouble.org is a great website that tells stories of resistance across the world, the strategies and tactics that are used in different situations. And it's one of the things I always talk to my students about, because just the range of possible forms of resistance, because especially our students, they know about protest. And that can be really great for building solidarity, but it doesn't necessarily get to the kinds of real change and resistance we need. Yeah, it's beautifultrouble.org.
Thank you.
Hi. This is a question I'm going to ask you to jump forward 2 years. There is a fair possibility that Congress is going to be dominated by Democrats. I know there's a bit of wishful thinking there, but some of the things I've read said that there's a lot of blue state Democratic blue states where there's a senatorial election, and then the entire House of Representatives is going to be elected. So let's assume, and we also have a president that has already made it clear that he doesn't respect the democratic process. January 6th was you can't have better evidence of that. So my question is, what does Congress do? What does a Democratic Congress do in January 2 years from now?
Well, Tom, I think if we have an election, we have a tremendous chance of getting the House back. There are only 3 Republicans in Biden districts. There are 13 House members in Trump districts. Going to have to support them. There are about 18 Republicans who had very narrow wins, and we need to target those districts. And so if we have a midterm election, odds are we will take the House back. Of course, you have the X factor, Elmo or Elon, whatever his name is. He could put $5–10 million in every marginal House race, and it would be like going out to lunch for him. So, we've got the problems, Citizens United, we've got the problems of fundraising and all that. But yes,
The Senate's much tougher. Most of the Republicans who are up in red states. I'm not aware of any Republicans at the moment there, and we have 2 Democrats who just retired in swing states. And at this point, it'd have to be a wave election, a big wave election, which is possible if Trump does incredible damage to the economy and to a whole bunch of essential programs. So, but the Senate is way tougher than the House. I'm focused on the House.
I'm going to briefly add, Larry Sabato from UVA did the first prediction on this. He's done this for most of the congressional races, and he predicts, akin to what Peter's been saying, Democrats probably, he thinks so far, are going to pick up the House maybe somewhere between 4 to 6 seats, or if things are really bad with the economy, it could go up to 12 to 14. So he thinks there's no way with the Senate. I want to throw out substantively, though, that I think whether it's House Democrats, any Democrats, what they need to figure out, if you look at this last election, is how to appeal to the working class and how to appeal to Gen Z. Gen Z has been more active in our elections than most generations before them, and active on a host of issues, but from the beginning has never identified with either party, and for good reason. Kind of a plague on both your houses has been the perspective. And figuring out, because Gen Z was significant in the midterm election of 2018, which defies most projections of how young people behave in elections, was significant for Biden in 2020 and for others who are running, and again in 2022. Something happened in 2024. So I think figuring out the working class and Gen Z is critical.
Thank you. And we are at 7:30, but I want to get one last question that was texted in, and somebody give a really quick answer.
Who do you think will enforce court orders rescinding Trump's illegal executive orders?
Excellent question.
Well, I mentioned that briefly. I mean, the normal course is, the Supreme Court makes a ruling, the president follows it, or the court, or district courts, or circuit courts. In this case, they're going to take it all the way to the Supreme Court and just keep doing things so far as we can see so far. If a court finds contempt, they can call upon the U.S. Marshals, but the U.S. Marshal Service is under the authority of Donald Trump. And again, there are people who mentioned the military. Milley resisted unlawful orders last time from Trump. And they have sworn, and the officer corps have sworn, and all members of the service, to uphold the Constitution of the United States. No, they do not swear an oath of allegiance to any president who issues unlawful orders or who disobeys the law, but they're about to try and dismantle that too and politicize the military. So
thank you.
I don't know who the hell's going to enforce things. It's got to be the American people who stand up and make them enforce things.
Wait, I have one more answer. Okay.
Professor Gash has one thing to say about this, and then we end.
States. States will. States can hold them accountable, right? We can look to the governor of Maine as an example of what states can do, right? States are not powerless. States can do something.
All right. Thank you so much to our panelists and to our audience. You're